So, Greg, let's talk a little bit about reverse dieting.
Ooh, my favorite.
So, a quick question. What does reverse dieting do?
Oh man. So I think it's good for reversing metabolic damage, for building up my metabolic capacity, helping me maintain weight on a higher total calorie intake, helping me maintain a higher calorie intake the next time I cut so I can get leaner easier, stay leaner longer without much of an issue. Those are all of the things that I've been led to believe that it does. And I will be very disappointed if it turns out that maybe it doesn't do some of those things.
Yeah, so with those claims, of the volumes of research supporting all of them, do you recall a single study showing anything in that general ballpark?
This isn't my area. This isn't the type of research that I personally keep up to date with, but due to the volume of claims being made about it and the confidence behind the claims being made about it, I have to assume that there is a lot of high quality, very strong data supporting it.
That would be...
And I'll also be very disappointed if I find out that that's not the case.
Yeah, that's a reasonable assumption, but in this segment, we're going to dig into it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're going to talk about reverse dieting. We're going to talk about a lot of the claims that are made about it and digging into the evidence, which doesn't... The evidence is far less exciting than a lot of the claims and hype surrounding reverse dieting. So we're going to dig into the details here, but before I get into it, I want to kind of explain the backdrop here, the history a little bit. So since about 2013, I have been chewing on a general set of related topics in my research, in my blog posts, and just in my own life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first things that got me interested in these topics was my own experiences as an athlete and as a coach, as a two-sport professional athlete, much like Bo Jackson. So the general set of topics is metabolic adaptation, weight regain after diets, and both short-term and long-term weight regulation. And it's not hard to figure out how I got there. I used to be a wrestler, transitioned into natural bodybuilding, and there's this cyclical process by which you get very, very lean for a competition, you regain weight, you get very, very lean again, and there are so many physiological adaptations and perturbations that occur throughout that series of changes. So that's what got me into this in 2013. The first time I ever published about this set of concepts was 2014 in the peer-reviewed literature. And to the best of my knowledge, one of my papers was the first to actually use the term reverse dieting in the peer-reviewed literature. Mm-hmm. So this is a topic I've been following closely since that paper was published in 2014, but was being written back in 2013. So I've been keeping my ear to the ground.
Do you think, I mean, just for the listeners, the viewers, do you think that might potentially be a source of bias where, you might stand to benefit from all of this research you're about to tell us about for how effective reverse dieting is? The fact that you were the first person to talk about it in the literature, all of this support for reverse dieting that you're about to tell us about kind of makes you look good in hindsight. So do you think you need to disclose that conflict of interest?
So yeah, the conflict of interest is that, as a researcher, the only way for me to really benefit from reverse dieting is by asserting, oh, this definitely works, mm-hmm. right? Like, I was the first person that introduced this into the literature. I'm going to try to take credit for that, and that's going to make me look like someone who was really ahead of the curve in the research, right? Mm-hmm. Another potential conflict of interest is, hey, we sell a diet app, we sell diet, products and content, etc., whatever the case is. We're in this industry, right? So absolutely, it would be beneficial for us to say, hey, everyone's excited about reverse dieting. Let's make some cash. Let's profit off of that excitement. So the conflict of interest argument would, on all accounts, say, Eric, it benefits you to say that reverse dieting absolutely lives up to the hype and is very, very worthwhile. As we're going to get into, though, I am unable to make any such evidence-based claim that reverse dieting lives up to basically any of the hype that surrounds it.
Wait, what?
Yeah, I know. So
I need to strap in.
Exactly. So you'll want to take a seat.
This is spooky.
You can leave the room if you need a minute to gather your thoughts and regain your composure. But I think it's best that we probably just dive into the evidence and kind of get into it.
Let's do it.
In recent years, reverse dieting's become really, really popular in some areas of the dieting world and the fitness world. And what we want to do is basically figure out, does it have supporting evidence? Is it at least compatible with the most relevant evidence available? And also, are there potentially some more parsimonious explanations for the positive anecdotes that we see on social media? There are a lot of people who say, I've done reverse dieting and it worked great for me. You should try it too. But one of the foundational elements of science and by extension, evidence-based practice is a general preference for parsimony, right? So if there's a set of observations, we could say, oh, this is a completely novel thing that's never been discovered and we don't understand and it's never been seen in the literature yet, but the literature will keep up eventually or catch up.
Yeah.
We would much prefer to say, oh, I can very much explain that set of observations with a very tidy explanation that's based on fairly straightforward mathematical explanations and stuff we've already seen in the literature. Like that would be preferable if both lend an equal amount of support for the topic, right? So, as you mentioned, reverse dieting often touted as a remedy for metabolic adaptation and as a strategy to facilitate easier and more sustainable weight loss.
Could you just hit us with a rough operational definition of metabolic adaptation, just for people who haven't listened to the show before?
Absolutely. If this is your first time listening to this show, that you've never heard of metabolic adaptation, so the general idea is we start dieting, right? We're restricting energy. We're in a calorie deficit or negative energy balance, which means that our daily energy expenditure is greater than our daily energy intake, right? So that helps us start losing weight. We're in this energy deficit or we're in negative energy balance. And as we're doing that, we start to lose fat tissue, right? And so metabolic adaptation describes kind of an entire cluster of adaptations that occur as a person continues on that weight loss trajectory. So their total energy expenditure goes down, which would be expected. When you go from being a larger person to a smaller person, you will burn fewer calories on a daily basis with no adaptation required. You just have less tissue.
Yeah, if there's 20% less of me, it takes 20% less energy to locomote myself around the world.
Right. Yeah. So we expect that energy expenditure should go down to some extent, but metabolic adaptation describes an adaptive reduction in energy expenditure. So energy expenditure goes down more than we should have predicted based on the loss of tissue. And what's really happening is it's kind of like putting your phone on low battery mode, right? Where you basically tell your phone like, hey, I haven't charged you in a while. Resources are tight. So all the extra stuff you normally do in the background, let's try to get as efficient as possible and minimize energy usage, right? So that's, in a very simplistic sense, what's going on. We're conserving energy to essentially try to prevent further weight loss, because if we let weight loss go on forever with no friction at all, we call that starvation in the biology business, right? So we have an interest in trying to introduce some friction there because our bodies can't tell that we're getting ready for a bodybuilding show. They think we're starving to death, And so the hypothalamus is a key brain structure that is orchestrating metabolic adaptation, which involves not just a reduction in energy expenditure, but a lot of the unpleasant side effects that we associate with dieting. So if you look at the metabolic adaptation literature, there's clear parallels to what we call relative energy deficiency in sport, or relative energy deficiency. And it's this whole cluster of things that happens when energy availability gets low, right? So we might have low libido. We might see that testosterone and thyroid hormone go down. We might be more lethargic, more hungry. It's just this entire set of adaptations that is all in response to acute and chronic restriction of energy. The hypothalamus is dictating this, and ultimately leptin is a key signal that is telling the hypothalamus, leptin being a hormone that's produced in fat cells, leptin is relaying the signal to the hypothalamus, energy is tight, you need to shut some things down. Mm-hmm. And very importantly, there are two things that cause pretty substantial perturbations in leptin levels. Number one would just be being in an energy deficit. So acute energy restriction reduces leptin. The second thing is the loss of fat tissue. So as fat cells start to shrink over time, they produce less leptin. So it's very clear in all the literature that being in an energy deficit independently contributes to metabolic adaptation and this reduction in energy expenditure, but also the loss of fat tissue over the long term also has an independent contribution. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's critically important. So the theory with reverse dieting is that basically increasing your calories very slowly and systematically and methodically can reverse metabolic adaptation and some of these other symptoms of dieting. So the idea is if you just start slowly increasing your calories, your body will say, oh, there's some more energy here, enough for me to turn off low battery mode, but not enough for me to decide to store any fat in the process or any appreciable amount of fat in the process. Mm-hmm. So a lot of folks use reverse dieting saying, well, I want to get back to how I used to feel before the diet. I want to get back to what my energy expenditure was before the diet because it's gone down a lot, but I don't want to regain much, if any, of the weight that was lost. Mm-hmm. So the idea then would be that these slow calorie increases are going to dramatically increase daily energy expenditure. They are going to be very carefully matched to your total daily energy expenditure as you go, such that you're able to ramp energy expenditure up and stop feeling so lethargic and get your hormone levels back to normal. And you're doing all of this stuff essentially in the absence of fat gain or with extremely minimal fat regain. Mm-hmm. That's the theory behind it. And so it gives rise to a number of common claims. So people will say it fixes a damaged metabolic rate. People will say that, that metabolic adaptation is essentially making it almost impossible for you to lose any more weight. And you need a reverse diet so that you can become able again to even have the hope of losing more weight in the future, mm-hmm. right? So there's a twofold claim there. One is that metabolic adaptation, which is sometimes claimed as like starvation mode or metabolic damage. The first claim is that that is a completely insurmountable roadblock to further weight loss mm-hmm. or just maintaining weight loss after your diet's done. The second part of the claim is that this is actually reversed and fixed by reverse dieting. Along those lines, you'll see claims that reverse dieting will fix any of those hormone changes that occurred during weight loss in addition to ramping up metabolic rate. In some cases, people will take this a step further and not just say, oh, reverse dieting will get you back to your original total daily energy expenditure at this lower body weight. Some people will even say, forget about it. Whatever weight you're at, this is going to supercharge your metabolic rate such that your energy expenditure is higher than you've ever experienced in the past. Mm-hmm. Like you are going to tap into a physiological state that you have not previously reached in your life. And one of the biggest claims, one of the biggest selling points that you see among reverse dieting proponents is you're doing this to lay the foundation for a better future. You are supercharging and building up your metabolic rate and energy expenditure because that's going to make your next diet easier, or it's going to make it way easier to sustain weight loss in the long run. Mm-hmm. The idea being you used to have to get down to 1,700 calories a day to effectively diet. Now you're only going to have to go down to 2,100 calories a day to effectively diet. Mm-hmm. And you're going to get just as lean in the same amount of time. That's usually how it goes. So there's a lot of questions that come up here. in this segment, I'm going to try to concisely go through and answer those questions based on actual scientific evidence, not just like theorizing and anecdotes and stuff like that. Before I get into it, I want to acknowledge what I'm trying to do here is break down a 60-page article into like a 20-ish minute segment, which I'm sure I'll go long on, so don't even check the timestamps.
You're absolutely going to go long, but I think this will still be audio-visual gold.
Yeah.
So just take the time you need.
Yeah, but I do want to acknowledge, if you're hearing this and saying, yeah, that sounds like the Cliff Notes, but I want the real stuff. We are going to have, by the time this episode airs, the article should be live over at macrofactorapp.com. And like I said, it's like 60 pages in its current form, and it's going to provide all the references that you hear in this segment and provide even more detail. So if you're into that, be sure to check out the link in the show notes. And if you're wondering why the show notes don't have like 38 studies referenced, it's because I'm going to link to the article and say, here's where they are. Okay. So some questions that I want to address by looking at the evidence. Do metabolic rates get damaged? Because damaged is a pretty serious word. Damage seems to imply to me that there is effort required to fix, right? So do metabolic rates get damaged in a really substantial and persistent way? Do low metabolic rates play a major role in preventing weight loss or promoting weight regain? Does reverse dieting actually resolve the effects of metabolic adaptation? Does reverse dieting supercharge your metabolic rate, especially after a diet? Does reverse dieting immediately after a weight loss phase prevent weight regain or facilitate a smoother transition into what we would call a maintenance phase, where you're just maintaining the weight loss that you achieved? Does reverse dieting make your next weight loss phase easier? And if reverse dieting doesn't fix metabolic adaptation, what should we actually do about it? So that kind of sets the stage for what we're going to talk about here. And with that out of the way, let's dig into some of the evidence here. So the first thing I want to address is metabolic adaptation versus metabolic damage, right? So metabolic adaptation, based on all the research that's been done, is a temporary state. And if you want to know how to reverse it, it's extremely easy to do that. And there's ample evidence showing metabolic adaptation being reversed. What it takes is twofold. The first step is getting out of an energy deficit. So going from negative energy balance to either neutral or positive. That eliminates the kind of immediate element that's driving metabolic adaptation. But there is that second element. Like I said, metabolic adaptation is being driven by an energy deficit and a loss of fat mass. So there's ample evidence that metabolic adaptation is very easily reversed. And what it takes is getting out of the energy deficit and regaining the fat that was lost. And I know that that's not what a lot of people want to hear, because you'd love to say, well, I wish the first part would take care of all of it. But based on the evidence, that doesn't seem to be the way that it works. It definitely looks like there's, I'm going to show a figure here from a great review paper by DeLu, who's done a lot of really excellent work on weight regain after weight loss. And based on the evidence available, it's very clear that there's really four things going on with weight regain after a diet. So if you go from negative energy balance to neutral or positive, you are going to eliminate the non-specific part of adaptive thermogenesis, which is in some ways synonymous with metabolic adaptation. Adaptive thermogenesis is only looking at the energy expenditure component of metabolic adaptation. So what we see is that in the weight regain process, getting out of a deficit immediately influences energy expenditure. It doesn't fully restore it to baseline. It just moves it up a little bit to where it was at the end of the diet, right? And then there's clearly an impact where regaining fat is going to be part of the process for fully restoring energy expenditure to its initial level. But there's also two other important regulatory factors in the weight regain process. One pertains to energy partitioning. And what the research would indicate is that until you get back up to a body fat percentage that is kind of similar-ish to where you started, you are going to preferentially regain fat rather than muscle. So it's not like this perfectly linear thing where you regain both at these completely similar rates. Usually what happens is you regain a lot of fat mass early in the weight regain process, and then lean mass starts to catch up much later. There's a preferential regain of fat at the beginning. And another important thing is hyperphagia, which basically describes this really excessive level of hunger that we experience during especially very aggressive dieting. That hyperphagia doesn't seem to really chill out until you've regained all of the lean mass that you lost during the diet, right? So there's a very robust body of literature telling us, what is dictating these things we experience during weight loss and what it takes to restore them. And quite frankly, there's not a lot of room in this literature to suggest that reverse dieting offers you a path out that doesn't involve, this process of restoring some fat mass and ultimately regaining a pretty decent amount of weight, both in the forms of fat mass and fat-free mass, right? So metabolic adaptation, just to kind of put a bow on this part, definitely a temporary state with various different drivers, and full restoration of total daily energy expenditure is something that, based on the evidence, is going to require some degree of fat regain in the process.
So just to be clear, you're saying people can lose weight and they certainly can maintain weight loss. Like we're not trying to play into the myth of all diets fail. No. Everyone always regains the weight they lose. It's just if you do lose a pretty substantial amount of weight and fat mass, you should anticipate over the pretty long term, at least some degree of reduction in metabolic rate and total daily energy expenditure. Right?
Yeah, that would be correct. Now, that leads me to an important point, though, which is that we've talked about some of these drivers of metabolic adaptation and what it takes to fully reverse all elements of metabolic adaptation 100%. But a really important question is, are we sure that we actually need to fully avoid metabolic adaptation, even if it were possible, or completely reverse it? How impactful is metabolic adaptation when it comes to weight loss and weight regain? So I'm going to put some images on the screen if you're following along on YouTube. But there's been a series of studies here. So there's a study by Martins and colleagues where they were looking at, how much does metabolic adaptation impact an individual's ability to actually lose weight during an intervention? What they found is participants lost about 14 kilograms on average. That's a substantial weight loss. That was like 13% of their body weight. The typical metabolic adaptation, as they quantified it, was about a 92 calorie reduction per day. And what they found was, yes, people who experienced more metabolic adaptation did lose less weight over the course of this intervention. But what they found was an increase in metabolic adaptation of 50 calories a day was associated with a lower weight loss of only half a kilogram. And so just purely based on the numbers there, is very clear to see that even the people who experience pretty substantial metabolic adaptation, you would still look at this and say you had a very successful weight loss diet here.
And that just to put that number in perspective, the 92 calories, that's disproportionate reductions in resting metabolic rate, not total daily energy expenditure, right? So disproportionate relative to predicted, looking at resting energy expenditure. So the presumably the reductions in total daily energy expenditure were probably larger, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But what this is telling us is using metabolic adaptation, looking at the resting metabolic rate component, basically just as a means of kind of sorting, who was really experiencing it versus who wasn't. That's really the utility there, rather than quantifying the total impact in terms of calories per day. But what they were able to see is just like the folks who were experiencing more metabolic adaptation in this study still had very successful weight loss programs. They just didn't lose quite as much during the program, right? Yeah. So it's not like they hit a brick wall. They just had a little bit more friction along the way. There's also a different study by Martins and colleagues, where they were looking at the time to reach a weight loss goal. And in this particular cohort, weight loss on average was 12.5 kilograms. Average weight loss time was 155 days. Again, they found that folks who experience more metabolic adaptation, it did take them a little longer to get to their weight loss goal. But for each 10 calorie increase in metabolic adaptation, kilocalories per day, the time to reach their weight loss goal increased by a single day, right? So when you're talking about that number and you're looking at, in this cohort, average metabolic adaptation was quantified as 46 calories per day. Again, the people experiencing metabolic adaptation were still, you would look at their progress and say, you are succeeding here. You are doing great. You might just need a little bit of extra time to get to where you're going. Yeah. Right.
It's like even in an extreme case, like if other people would need to diet for 3 months, even with pretty extreme metabolic adaptation, like you should still be able to get the job done in 4 months.
Yeah. So what these studies are showing us is that with metabolic adaptation, even if you're experiencing it much more than the average individual, you should still there's still a very clear path between you and your goal. It might just require slightly greater reductions in calorie intake, or alternatively, just a slightly longer dieting timeline. This is friction. It's not an insurmountable roadblock, right? Another study by Martins and colleagues, this group has been doing a ton of work in this area over the last few years. They found that metabolic adaptation was not a substantial barrier when it comes to long-term maintenance of weight loss. So they actually looked at over a 1 to 2 year follow-up period. Metabolic adaptation was found on average after weight loss, again, about in the 54 calorie per day range. But this didn't really correlate with people's likelihood of regaining weight over the next 2 years. There are much more important predictors of weight regain that really have nothing to do with metabolic rate or metabolic adaptation. It usually comes down to, are you continuing to monitor your health-related behaviors and your weight-related behaviors? Are you continuing to track your food, keeping your activity level up, continuing to monitor body weight so that as it starts creeping up, you can then address it before it gets, starts to really accumulate. So there are much more impactful predictors of weight regain than anything to do with metabolic rate or metabolic adaptation. And then there's also an interesting study by Fothergill and colleagues. They were looking at metabolic adaptation 6 years after the Biggest Loser competition, which I resent almost everything about the Biggest Loser competition. It's unsustainable. It's not good. But one of the silver linings is that there was good research done surrounding the Biggest Loser competition, which, if you're not familiar, it was like a TV show with this extremely aggressive weight loss intervention. The intervention, like I said, I'm not really a huge fan of how it was done and how it was portrayed as a television program. But nonetheless, there was some good research that came of it. What they found was that after this 30-week intervention, the amount of metabolic adaptation that you experienced, and there was a tremendous magnitude in this study because of how extreme the intervention was, after the weight loss period, that metabolic adaptation didn't really correlate much at all with your likelihood of regaining weight. What they did find was that people who still had metabolic adaptation present at the 6-year follow-up were actually the people who very successfully prevented weight regain. So right after the diet, metabolic adaptation was not predictive of future weight regain. At the follow-up period, metabolic adaptation was essentially a marker of success for reducing weight regain, because if you regain the weight, the metabolic adaptation goes away, as we've already kind of covered. So what this research shows us, and there's actually even a better study, I would say. There's a study by Rimbach and colleagues that was published just this year as part of that huge doubly labeled water database. And we've been talking about, they've been cranking out really high impact papers from that, just in terms of their utility.
Was that the same database that the Ponser study about metabolic rates across the lifespan where that came from?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
That database and the projects surrounding it have really helped clarify a lot of things about metabolism and energy expenditure. And there was one recent paper that came out this year, and they were basically interested in figuring out, like, is low total daily energy expenditure a risk factor for weight gain? And similarly, is high total daily energy expenditure, is this actually protective against future weight gain? Like, what is looking at someone's energy expenditure tell us about their current body composition in terms of predictive utility, and what is likely to happen in future weeks? And what they found using gold standard measurement techniques is that essentially looking at someone's total daily energy expenditure now doesn't really tell you a ton about what their body composition is likely to be. And looking at how their total daily energy expenditure changes over time doesn't really tell you much about, how their body composition is going to change. And actually what they found, some of their analyses were basically null findings and said, yeah, energy expenditure doesn't give us a lot of actionable information here. The only correlations they found were actually the opposite of what reverse dieting would imply. So looking at adjusted values for total daily energy expenditure, they found that higher and like increasing values for this adjusted total daily energy expenditure value was actually correlated with weight gain over the time frame studied. So I'll read the quote here, what they concluded. This suggests that low energy expenditure, total daily energy expenditure, is not a risk factor for, and high total daily energy expenditure is not protective against weight or body fat gain over the time intervals tested. So basically, this idea that you need to reverse diet so that you have this high energy expenditure that induces future weight loss or prevents weight regain after dieting, it doesn't seem to be compatible with what we're seeing here. And even just the purpose statement of, well, you need reverse dieting because metabolic adaptation just slams the brakes on your weight loss. Again, we're not really seeing those types of claims supported by the literature.
Yeah. I think that, I think one thing that may be helpful just to like talk about and clarify is that I think it's very easy and tempting to test theoretical counterfactuals about yourself that did not in fact occur. And so by that I mean, so like personally, I have a relatively low rate of total daily energy expenditure relative to both my size and activity levels. Like I'm eating like a little under 2,000 calories per day to lose weight very gradually. And I'm like low 220s and relatively active. People hear that and they're like, that's crazy. Like that seems way lower than it should be. And it might be easy for me to look at that and say, man, if I had a higher rate of total daily energy expenditure, it would be a lot easier for me to lose weight. But the thing is, like, I don't know that. And also, like, a lot of the difficulty comes from, like, how the hunger cues you have and how you respond to them.
Yeah.
And people will hear, like, people who are smaller than me will hear, oh, you're under 2,000 calories a day at your size? Man, if I had to go that low, I would be super hungry all the time. But the thing is, like, I'm not. Like, I feel generally fine because to some degree, like, hunger responses are kind of tuned to how much energy you're actually expending.
Yeah.
And so if I was burning 500 more calories per day and eating 500 more calories per day, if I look at that, assuming that my feelings consuming 2,500 calories per day in that situation would be the same as they currently feel now, I'd be like, oh, that would make things so much easier. But if I was burning 500 more calories per day, I'd probably feel the same on 2,500 calories as I currently do on 2,000.
Yeah.
And so, like, those are counterfactuals that you can't test within an individual. And it's always easy to think, man, if I could just eat more, this weight loss diet would be so much easier than it currently is. But if you were someone who could eat more, that would mean you were also burning more. And that might not actually make the process all that much easier.
Yeah, the that pairing between your intake and expenditure is much more impactful for how you're feeling in that process than just the raw absolute numbers of calories consumed.
Yeah,
for sure. Now, one of the things I want to get at here, so we've talked about how generally speaking, energy expenditure just measured kind of randomly at baseline doesn't really seem to tell us much about like how lean you're likely to be or how your weight is likely to change over the next several weeks. Nonetheless, I'm sure that a lot of people are still thinking, well, whatever, I'll take my chances. I want to do something that may supercharge my metabolic rate because I have faith that once I do my next diet, I'm going to feel way better dieting on higher calories. But built into that is the assumption that everyone experiences the same change when you go from your baseline starting calories to negative energy balance in a diet, right? So it's almost like everyone assumes, well, whoever starts the diet with 2,100 calories is going to be able to diet on higher calories than someone who starts the diet at 1,900 calories, right? Like it's all going to be this like perfectly linear transformation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the literature casts an extreme amount of doubt on that. So there have been two recent studies, one by Nunes and colleagues, one by Hallstein and colleagues. And what they were interested in was looking at the concept of metabolic phenotypes, right? And so a phenotype is, broadly speaking, kind of like a set of observable characteristics. And in this case, we're talking about a set of observable characteristics that allow us to kind of group people based on how they react to energy, right? So some people are very good at saving and conserving energy. And these people, when they diet, they experience large magnitudes of metabolic adaptation. So they get into an energy deficit and their body is like, no, we're conserving energy. Let's drop energy expenditure because of that drop in calorie intake. These folks are also good at conserving energy on the other side of the spectrum. If they start eating more calories, they very readily store fat because that's the most efficient thing to do energy-wise. There are also people on the other end of the spectrum who are spendthrift metabolic phenotypes. What that means is they're very wasteful of energy. So when they start dieting and they get into negative energy balance, they don't experience such large metabolic adaptations. They don't experience big drop-offs in energy expenditure. But if you overfeed them, they ramp up energy expenditure very precipitously, very rapidly, and they're actually very resistant to fat gain. There have been interesting studies where they take people into the lab and say, everyone's eating 40% more calories than they need for the next 8 weeks, right? This huge amount of overfeeding consistently, well controlled. And what they find is some people gain a ton of fat mass and some people simply don't. Some of these spendthrift individuals just ramp up energy expenditure and they resist that weight gain. There's nothing mysterious about it. You can look at their energy expenditure and say, well, that's where the calories went,
Yeah.
But there's a clear difference.
They're just sitting in their chair, basically vibrating.
Yeah. So there's no mystery involved here.
Yeah.
We can see some people are more likely to ramp up energy expenditure when overfed and they resist fat gain. Other people, much more energy efficient. If you put in energy, they say, cool, I'll store it for later.
Yeah.
No big deal. Now, the reason that this is important is because...
Yeah, all of the people who think it's cool to be able to easily diet down to the point where you have visible abs, that's cool and all. But, I mean, when human society falls apart and we're all fighting over resources, it's people like me who are going to be on the top of the heap. And that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah. Be careful what you wish for, I suppose.
Correct.
So with Nunes and Hallstein, both of these studies were interested in looking at metabolic phenotypes. And so Hallstein looked at acutely, the people who experience large reductions in energy expenditure during very short-term underfeeding and overfeeding. So, for example, if we just have you fast for a day, who has an enormous drop in energy expenditure and who has a much smaller drop in energy expenditure? Nunes and colleagues looked at it very differently and looked over a longer intervention. Who seems to be resisting fat loss versus who seems to be losing fat quite readily and very effectively, right? So the people who are clearly reducing energy expenditure and preserving fat despite the fact that they're trying to lose it over time. So what's really cool about these studies is they look at different time scales, but they're still separating people into these thrifty and spendthrift groups. But here's what the results indicate.
Mm-hmm.
In both cases, the people who were considered thrifty, the people who are good at conserving energy, you would probably assume, well, at baseline, they probably already had low energy expenditure because these are just energy efficient folks.
Mm-hmm.
Not the case. Actually, the complete opposite of the case. In both instances, the evidence would suggest that people who experience the greatest amount of metabolic adaptation, and by extension, the people who experience smaller increases in energy expenditure when their calories go up, these people had higher energy expenditure at baseline compared to the spendthrift individuals. And so what this means is, and this is critically important, and in my opinion, one of the most important reasons that I am doubtful of reverse dieting.
Would you maybe say that they had high metabolic capacity at baseline, but still experienced metabolic damage as soon as they got into a deficit?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even if you said, I believe reverse dieting works as advertised, literally, the whole idea there is like, oh, well, yeah, ramp up your metabolic rate. And that way, when you start your diet, energy expenditure will be higher and it'll be way easier next time around. What the evidence tells us is that people who experience more considerable metabolic adaptation, their energy expenditure is higher right before they start that diet. They already have that higher metabolic capacity. The issue is not that they're starting at the wrong number. The issue is that when they go into a deficit, they experience a larger drop. And there's absolutely, and I can't overstate this, no evidence to suggest that reverse dieting would change that in any way. There's no reason to believe that even if you built up your energy expenditure in the off season and said, okay, I built up my energy expenditure, it's time to diet. If you're the kind of person who would actually need this intervention more than a spendthrift individual, there is no reason to believe that your energy expenditure is not going to drop the same exact way the moment you start that diet. We have no reason to believe that any buildup of metabolic capacity before the diet will carry forward at all. And another important part there, like I said, thrifty individuals, based on their research, experience smaller increases in energy expenditure as their increase in calorie intake. So what that means is, the first part was we're granting, yes, as you ramp up energy intake, you're going to ramp up energy expenditure. So the first issue is, if you're someone who experiences a lot of metabolic adaptation, it's very, very doubtful that would carry forward at all. But the second issue is, before we even get there, someone who experiences larger magnitudes of metabolic adaptation, a thrifty individual, is less likely to even be able to ramp up through deliberate overfeeding. So deliberately increasing calorie intake. As far as we can tell, the people who actually respond to that and would see meaningful increases in total daily energy expenditure are people who are spendthrift individuals. They don't even experience really substantial metabolic adaptation when they diet. And these are people who are naturally quite lean because of their innate resistance to fat gain. And so what that tells us is, based on the evidence, the people who, quote unquote, need reverse dieting the most, assuming it actually did what it's supposed to, stand to benefit the least. It's very unlikely that they're going to be able to ramp up energy expenditure through overfeeding. And even if they did, that probably doesn't matter, because once they get into a deficit, they are, based on the evidence, likely to experience a substantial drop in energy expenditure.
Yeah.
So I know I'm running long, so for some of these parts, I'm going to kind of hit the details and again refer people to the full article for even more nuance and explanation. One piece of evidence I do want to acknowledge is a study by Longstrom and colleagues, which is one of the few that actually compares people after a bodybuilding competition who took a kind of reverse diety approach versus people who just said, whatever, I'm going to regain weight pretty quickly here. And the reason I highlight this paper is essentially the analysis showed a very straightforward pattern. And this was a case series. So this is not like a randomized controlled trial. This is not the type of thing where, you're going to be able to make super strong claims based on, the reverse diet versus alternative strategies were not strictly controlled by the research team and things like that. But basically, this was a study that I collaborated on with some really excellent researchers looking at physique athletes after a competition who are just doing what they think is best for themselves, right? A very hands-off approach. But the statistical analysis showed some pretty straightforward patterns where the folks who just let themselves regain some weight and some fat mass after the show, they recovered quite well from all that stuff that we would kind of lump under that metabolic adaptation umbrella. So the hormone changes, the metabolic rate changes, those were expedited by just saying, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and let myself regain some weight. The people who appeared to try to keep body weight pretty stable and just slowly ramp up calorie intake, based on the measurements taken, it seems like that really interfered with the recovery of hormone levels and the recovery of metabolic rate. And so without painting with too broad of a brush, simply put, in this study, which is the most direct evidence we have of something that would be called reverse dieting, it just really fell flat. It seemed to really delay recovery from an intense diet and essentially failed to deliver on a lot of those promises by which it's marketed. This idea that, oh no, it'll facilitate recovery, but you don't have to deal with all that unwanted fat gain. These results directly oppose that concept and suggest that the reluctance to regain some weight in that process, it does in fact kind of stop some of that recovery in its tracks.
Yeah.
Now,
just take your time. Cover everything you want to. My segment ran long as well. Just, you know what? Let's try to make this as good and thorough of a piece of audio content as possible. Let's not rush it.
Yeah, let's take our time then. So at this point, just kind of recapping, metabolic adaptation exists. Mm-hmm. It's impermanent. It does add some friction to the weight loss process, but it does not make further weight loss impossible, nor does it guarantee you're going to regain weight. So that's really important. Second of all, we can categorize people into these metabolic phenotypes based on who experiences more metabolic adaptation and who experiences less. What we know from that research is that the folks who experience a lot of metabolic adaptation, which again does add some friction in weight loss, those folks actually tend to have higher energy expenditure at baseline before the weight loss diet begins. So the idea that they are struggling because they didn't build up their metabolic capacity is directly contradicted by the research available. The research available would also suggest that those folks, even if they wanted to increase calories to build up their metabolic rate, are actually least likely to be able to do that because people who have this thrifty phenotype do not experience these robust increases in energy expenditure when their energy intake starts to drift upward. Mm-hmm. So what that means is it doesn't look like building up metabolic capacity is the problem in the first place. It doesn't look like even if you did it, it would carry forward into the next dieting phase. It should basically just vanish immediately when you start dieting again. And it's very unlikely that the people who need it the most, the people who experience the greatest metabolic adaptation, would even be able to do it because of that lack of increase in energy expenditure during overfeeding. Mm-hmm. The idea that you can do this reverse dieting to get all the benefits of recovering from a previous weight loss diet without weight gain or without considerable weight gain is actually directly contradicted by evidence and directly contradicted by the most relevant evidence that we have available. Mm-hmm. Of course, a randomized controlled trial would be better, but we have to go with the evidence that we have currently. The next thing I want to address is kind of an extension of what I mentioned previously. So we've talked a little bit about metabolic phenotypes and said, well, okay, the people who would be most interested in building up metabolic capacity through reverse dieting, first of all, seem to have the least capacity to do it, but also have larger drops in energy expenditure when they shift to a diet anyway. Mm-hmm. But another thing that is important to ask yourself before that, before you even get into phenotypes is, well, who is actually interested in this concept in the first place? Mm-hmm. Like, who are the people who are saying, I need the reverse diet because my I'm having troubles with weight loss and the way that I'm pursuing weight loss is unsustainable, it's usually people who are relatively predisposed to fat gain in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's very rare that I hear someone who says, yeah, I'm naturally very lean. I have been all my life. But metabolic adaptation is really holding me back here.
Yeah, someone who can get in stage-ready condition on like 2,400 calories per day, they're not trying to reverse diet. Like they're in pretty good shape.
Yeah, and so that brings me to another point, which is related to metabolic phenotypes in a way. But you know what we find during controlled overfeeding studies is, like I said previously, some people do experience large increases in energy expenditure, and they very strongly resist fat gain. And I'll show an image on the screen that demonstrates some of this data from Levine and colleagues. On the other hand, a lot of individuals experience minimal change in energy expenditure, and they very readily and rapidly gain fat. And so what that tells us is people who are likely to report a history of struggling with weight loss, people who are likely to be pursuing weight loss goals in the first place, almost by definition are folks who probably don't have this, in this context, this advantage of being resistant to fat gain in the first place. It kind of gives us an indicator that the people who are most interested in exploiting this concept of reverse dieting or utilizing it in their own fitness journey, they are probably not these individuals who are in the spendthrift phenotype, who are resistant to fat gain in the first place. So it puts us in a position where, based on all the evidence we've covered so far, the people who are most interested in using this, again, this type of strategy, even if it worked, would be least accessible to those individuals. Now, moving on, there's one additional thing I want to mention here in terms of overfeeding, and that is the fact that a lot of these overfeeding studies are commonly used to support claims about reverse dieting. They say, well, look, at the group level, you put these people in this huge caloric surplus and their energy expenditure goes up. Therefore, we're going to build up your metabolic rate in the off season, right? As I've already covered, that interpretation fully ignores the concept of metabolic phenotypes, which is a major oversight. But an even bigger oversight is the fact that it treats just overfeeding from a natural body weight as if it's the same thing as increasing calories after weight loss.
Yeah.
So when we look at weight-reduced individuals, whether they lost their weight 5 years ago or 5 days ago, being in a weight-reduced state is a unique physiological state. So I mentioned previously all of these different factors that occur with weight regain. We talk about how there's an immediate response when you go from negative to neutral energy balance, right? But it's not very impactful. Until people get back to a somewhat similar body fat level in the weight regain process, there's ample, tremendous amounts of evidence to show that people preferentially regain fat. And they do that very, very efficiently. So the fact that you have previously lost weight, especially if it happened recently, very dramatically influences your response to overfeeding. Even if you were someone who might have experienced this adaptive increase in energy expenditure, doing that after a weight loss phase is exceedingly unlikely. What we see in virtually all of the weight regain literature is that if you have previously lost weight and you start ramping calories up, you will very efficiently regain fat mass. That has been shown many, many, many different times. And so I'll put that, I put that image up previously with the Duluth study where they highlight an entire body of literature indicating that weight regain is a kind of unique, being in a weight reduced state is a unique physiological state.
Yeah.
Overfeeding after a diet is extremely different physiologically than overfeeding from your natural body weight. And so this idea that we can just kind of slowly ramp up calories and for some reason, contrary to all the pre-existing evidence, your body is going to decide to burn those calories rather than storing. It just contradicts volumes of research on weight regain.
Yeah, it reminds me of I don't know how popular this still is, but maybe like 3 to 5 years ago, it was a popular idea put forth in the bodybuilding community that after a bodybuilding competition, you were as lean as you were ever going to get. So your insulin sensitivity was as high as it was ever going to get. There was going to be a huge nutrient partitioning advantage. So if you started overfeeding from that point, you'd be able to gain a ton of muscle. And partially in support of that, people would cite a study by Forbes based on overfeeding research showing that in general, leaner people without a resistance training stimulus, you just give them more calories, they gain weight, but a larger proportion of the weight they gain was lean mass versus people with more body fat. You overfeed them, a larger proportion of the weight they gain would be fat mass. And they just assumed that that would generalize. But the Forbes data was based on people who were in neutral energy balance, not in a weight-reduced state, and then overfed, versus, bodybuilders, physique athletes after a show, very much in a weight-reduced state. And so people were putting forth this idea, but all of the controlled research, all of the case studies on bodybuilders and physique athletes showed the exact opposite. Like basically what you're saying. When they did overfeed to a large extent after a show, you would see a bump in lean mass just from, body water, glycogen resynthesis, etc., but mostly preferential fat gain. And I think that idea has lost some popularity in recent years. I think just because it didn't play out in the real world. Like in theory, people thought it made sense, not accounting for the fact that, weight neutral and weight reduced individuals, very different sets of like physiological baselines there. And yeah, like I think I basically think a lot of bodybuilders, especially like natural bodybuilders, tried to do that. Like, oh, I'm going to get shredded and then I'm going to put on like 10 pounds of muscle as I rebound from the show. And like, it just didn't work out for any of them.
Yeah.
And so yeah, like I think the bodybuilding community has started to learn its lesson from that. But yeah, the basic principle extends to other populations as well.
Yeah, I mean, and we see in weight loss trials, after weight loss is achieved, weight regain is very common, but it happens gradually over time. It seems hard to imagine that whether we're looking at a randomized controlled trial in an obese population, or we're looking at a study in extremely lean physique athletes, I'm trying to find the instance where if you just go slow enough, like overfeeding just supercharges your metabolic rate and you, for some reason, don't regain fat. The weight reduced state makes us very efficient at regaining fat, and there's really no evidence to suggest that simply going slower is going to somehow rectify or circumvent that. Mm-hmm. And actually, that's a really nice transition to a good example of that. So you mentioned previously proof of concept studies. So you were talking previously about calf stretching and muscle growth, and how sometimes we look at a study that's the most extreme case just to say, okay, if this is ever going to work, it's going to work in this really extreme instance. Yeah. And then we can refine it from there and see if it matters in practical day-to-day strategies, mm-hmm. right? So with that in mind, I'm going to lean on the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. And this was a very extreme experiment where the participants in the study got very, very, very lean. So they demonstrated some of the largest magnitudes of metabolic adaptation that have ever been documented in well-controlled research. So if a strategy about attenuating or reversing metabolic adaptation was ever going to work, this was the study where it ought to work. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people say that they're going to use reverse dieting because for some reason, after weight loss, if you simply go slow enough with your increases in calories, it will set you up for a smoother transition to your maintenance phase or attenuate weight regain as you're doing that transition. So people often talk about this experiment by Keyes and colleagues, and they often talk about the metabolic adaptation component because it's flashy and it's the biggest numbers ever observed, to my knowledge. And it was kind of the first time that people said, whoa, look at these crazy adaptations to weight loss. But there was a refeeding component and there was a stratified refeeding component. So they put people into these 4 different groups, T, G, L, and Z. And they basically said, okay, group Z, we're going to give you a much smaller kind of transition into this refeeding, so smaller and slower calorie increases. Group L, we're going to ramp you up faster, so bigger calorie increases more rapidly out of the gate. Group G was a little faster, Group T even faster. And what they looked at was there was this controlled 12-week overfeeding period and then a non-controlled overfeeding period after that where they said, okay, now do your thing and eat what you want, which is how we all live our lives, right? So, no one is like sitting there like, yeah, I just finished my diet and I'm waiting for some authority figure to deliver my meals for the day because all of my intake is perfectly controlled. At the end of the day, real world scenarios, we're all left to our own devices there, right? Yeah. But anyway, in this controlled overfeeding period, if you look at the rate of weight gain in that slow group, they honestly didn't gain an appreciable amount of weight over the first 6 weeks of refeeding, which is remarkable because, again, we're talking about people who were safely on the brink of starvation. I mean, they were close, right? It was monitored, it was medically supervised, but these people were shredded and they were not eating much. Yeah. And they were doing a lot of activity as well.
This was before the Declaration of Helsinki, right?
Indeed.
When you could still get away with some shit in research that probably you shouldn't.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, they basically stayed weight stable for the first 6 weeks of controlled overfeeding. It was a very gradual thing that I think you could argue is relatively reminiscent of what people suggest reverse dieting ought to look like. Mm-hmm. And so at the end of this 12-week period, they started out the first 6 weeks basically weight stable, and then it starts to creep up, and they've gained an appreciable amount of weight by week 12, but there's very clear gaps. The slower refeeding groups regained less weight over 12 weeks than the faster refeeding groups, because of course they did. That's how numbers work with calorie surpluses, right?
Yeah.
The question is, well, what happens after they go to the ad libitum stage where they're able to eat whatever they want and they're left to their own devices, much like we are in the real world? The slower groups just regained, like they completely closed the gap.
Yeah.
They very promptly went right back to the same approximate body weight as the folks who just gained it earlier. Mm-hmm. And so in this instance, in the most extreme application of metabolic adaptation, those short-term benefits of kind of slowing the process over the first 12 weeks, they yielded virtually no benefit that persisted beyond the next couple months. Mm-hmm. Once they were back to ad libitum feeding, they very promptly basically caught up with the fat gain of the other groups. So the other groups kind of tapered off as we would anticipate based on what we've talked about with fat mass dictating a lot of that process. And the groups that took it slower, they just caught up, mm-hmm. and they caught up very quickly.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing here is that, as I've stated previously, the people who are most interested in reverse dieting, even if it worked, it would be less accessible to them. But based on the literature, we really have no reason to believe that it should work, or more importantly, that it does work. Mm-hmm. It's not like there's evidence of this working and we just haven't figured out why.
Yeah.
We know why it shouldn't. And we have also seen that if it did, it's just not happening in any of the most well-controlled studies that are most relevant.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't work based on what we know. And based on what we've observed, it doesn't appear to work.
Yeah.
And I certainly acknowledge that we haven't done a lot of direct study on controlled reverse dieting interventions. But at this point, it's almost hard to justify doing it.
Yeah.
There's just not enough of a kernel of optimism in the literature where you would say this is a worthwhile thing that we ought to do a huge randomized controlled trial on.
That makes sense to me, but here's, I'll do a little segue for you.
Wow.
So with all of that being said, it still seems like there are a lot of people who have tried reverse dieting and they think it worked for them. So what might be going on in those situations?
Yeah. So I believe that there are 4 what I call illusions that make reverse dieting in the real world, in practice, seem more useful than it is. And before I get into it, I do want to acknowledge that what I'm doing here is not doubting the experience of people who have noted, positive experiences here. It's really important to clarify. I'm not saying that you're lying or you're misinterpreting what occurred. Well, I guess I am saying you're misinterpreting, but basically, I'm not indicating that
you're not grossly and maliciously misinterpreting.
Right. I'm not saying, oh, you're full of crap. I'm not saying, oh, you're foolish for being misled by these illusions. I'm arguing that there are things that occur during overfeeding that they're very compelling illusions. If you were doing it, you would have every reason to believe what I'm doing right now is absolutely working as intended.
Yeah,
right?
You're reaching incorrect, but very, very understandable incorrect conclusions.
Absolutely. These are conclusions that I would not fault anyone for reaching or sharing with excitement, right? Mm-hmm. So, illusion number 1 pertains to simply just improved consistency of dietary tracking and improved adherence to one's dietary targets. So, if we look at the literature, we'll see that registered dietitians, who are, I would say, the most well-trained nutrition profession in the United States, that's not really an arguable statement. They have the most hands-on direct training for what it's like, in day-to-day dietary interventions or treatment programs, right? Mm-hmm. So very well-trained nutrition professionals, they have about a 20% error in the research when you say, okay, how much are you eating? And then you actually go verify how much they're eating. Like they have a 20% underestimation of their actual energy intake. Mm-hmm. And again, that's highly trained folks eating the stuff they normally eat, just trying to do their normal thing, not trying to do any changes with dynamic targets fluctuating, not trying to eat foods they're not used to. That's just like a baseline 20% underestimation. When we look at research in people who report a history of being unable to lose weight despite very low calorie intakes, we find that they often underestimate their calorie intake by about 50%, while simultaneously overestimating their physical activity, again, by about 50%. Mm-hmm. So we know that it's very, very common and understandable for people to underestimate their intake when they are not watching it like a hawk, mm-hmm. right? And so you introduce an intervention like reverse dieting. And in many cases, you have people saying, well, the intervention here, the magic, is that this week we're adding 5 grams of carbs to your diet, mm-hmm. or 10 grams of carbs to your diet. Necessarily, it insists upon a level of consistency and precision with tracking that, in my opinion, over the long term is unsustainable. But if nothing else makes you say, if I don't track every little trace of my diet, I might lose the entire intervention. Yeah. Right? Like if being off by 10 grams turns it from an intervention to not an intervention, you must be perfect. Yeah. And so if we look at the magnitude of common underestimation, even in people who are doing a pretty damn good job with their tracking, it's not unreasonable to suggest that some people will find an extra few hundred calories when they start tracking with this level of precision. And what that means is someone will think back to their previous time where they were at a similar body weight and they say, back then when I was like kind of loosely doing a pretty okay job tracking, back then I was maintaining this body at 2,200 calories a day. But now I'm maintaining a very similar body at 2,600 calories per day. So mm-hmm. my energy expenditure, I've ramped it up 400 calories. It's very possible that in many cases, you've simply identified the extra 400 calories that historically were not being consistently tracked. Mm-hmm. Either because your day-to-day tracking had some error, or back then you didn't think twice about finishing the kids' leftovers just to avoid food waste, or back then you didn't really worry about the extra 2 beers on Saturday watching the football game. Mm-hmm. So we can find extra calories through extremely precise tracking that actually look very similar to the purported increase in energy expenditure with reverse dieting in some of these anecdotes. Yeah. Illusion number 2 is that, practically speaking, a person's maintenance calorie target is more like a range of targets, mm-hmm. right? So, for example, if your true total daily energy expenditure is 2,200 calories a day. And in this scenario, we're going to pretend it never changes. It's totally stable. So eating 2,200 calories every single day should keep your body weight totally flat in this hypothetical.
Yeah.
If you were to drop it to 2,100, you would be in a 100-calorie deficit. It would probably take you a pretty long time to figure out that you're actually losing weight, right? So you're in a 100-calorie, you're eating 100 calories below your actual maintenance level. But like, if you just crunch the numbers, it should take you over 3 months to lose a kilogram. And then you factor in the fact that every day our body weight is constantly bouncing up and down because of water and sodium and glycogen and all that crap. And the bulk content in our GI tract. So basically what I'm implying here is that for a lot of people, it might be hard without like some kind of nice weight trending software and without very diligent tracking. It might be really hard if you have a total daily energy expenditure of 2,200 calories a day to actually know with any degree of certainty that if you're eating 2,000 calories per day, you're actually in a deficit. Or if you're eating 2,400 calories per day, you're actually in a surplus. It could take you literally months to figure that out and for it to become apparent.
And that's assuming that your maintenance energy expenditure is perfectly static.
Correct.
Because I mean, there is like an actual range on top of that.
Yes.
Like, you know, your maintenance range might be 21 to 2,300 calories. So if you go down to 21, you are still at maintenance. Like your NEAT goes down a little bit. At that level, it probably wouldn't actually be reductions in resting energy expenditure. But, you know, you like NEAT can adapt 200 calories like pretty easily.
Yeah.
So yeah, like in that case, you know, maybe you were maintaining at 2,000 or like 2,100 before, and now you get up to 2,300. It's like, oh, I built my metabolic capacity. No, like both of those were already maintenance calorie intakes in the first place. You just kind of found the top of that range.
Yeah.
Which might be nice, but it's not a unique adaptation.
Correct. And so for a lot of people, I do wonder to what extent some of these positive anecdotes of reverse dieting are people who didn't really recognize that they were either at the bottom of that range or even in a small deficit. And, you know, they're just like, oh yeah, I guess I'm maintaining weight approximately at 2,000 calories. And then they don't really realize that they're in a slight caloric surplus when they're at 2,400 calories. And they say, whoa, I just increased my energy expenditure 400 calories a day. And we can explain that pretty concisely without any physiological adaptations needed.
Yeah.
The third illusion that I referred to in my article is that calorie intake, we view it instantaneously, right? So when we bump our calories to 3,000 a day, we say, I eat 3,000 calories per day. And we don't really think about, well, what was my kind of trajectory of calorie intake over the last 6 months or over the last 12 months, right? So we talk about calorie intake in an instantaneous way, but body weight change and body composition change is cumulative in nature, right? So for example, let's say hypothetically you finish a diet, you accomplish your weight loss goal. At the end of the diet, your energy expenditure every day is 2,600 calories a day. And you decide, okay, I'm just going to do a maintenance phase and keep my intake at 2,600 calories. 16 weeks later, still taking in 2,600 calories, you still weigh the same. Again, it's an oversimplification that implies that everything's static and never changes, but that's where we're at. Now, let's say that you finish your diet and your energy expenditure is still 2,600 calories per day, but you ended the diet consuming 2,225 calories a day, right? So you're in a deficit. That makes sense because you're losing weight, right? So instead of just jumping to 2,600, you say, I'm actually going to slowly build this up over time, right? And so very linearly in a stepwise manner, every week you make a change and you build up from 2,225 up to 2,975 calories per day. So you just keep ramping it up. At the end of that 16-week period, making a change at the beginning of each week, building up to 2,975, you're thinking, whoa, when I compare this to the alternative, I've built up my metabolic rate by almost 400 calories. I'm maintaining the same weight, but instead of eating 2,600 calories per day, I'm eating 2,975. The reality is that both of those strategies have the same cumulative energy balance, because during the first part of that reverse diet, you were still in a fairly substantial calorie deficit. You didn't actually get into neutral energy balance until about halfway through it. And then, the other half, when you're looking at that intake of 2,975, you are in a small surplus, but you just got there. And so you have not had time to accumulate that body fat. So it's an illusion by which, instead of just jumping to maintenance, if we ramp it up over 16 weeks, it looks like we've built up metabolic capacity by 400 calories per day. But we can fully explain that with math that requires no increase in energy expenditure whatsoever. Those are two mathematically equivalent approaches in terms of the cumulative amount of energy that would be stored.
Yeah.
Now, we can look at another example where, let's say, instead of trying to maintain, you say, whatever, I'm cool with a little bit of weight gain, right? So you finish your diet, total energy expenditure is 2,600 calories per day. And so you decide, I'm just going to bump up to 2,975 right out of the gate. So the last example, that's what you built up to. In this case, you say, whatever, I'm fine with a little bit of weight regain. I'm going to bump up 2,975 every day, 16 weeks. Eventually, you have a positive energy balance over time of 42,000 calories of extra calories coming in. Now, in a different scenario, you can start at the same place and say, I'm going to start at 2,225, just like I did in the last reverse dieting example, but I'm going to ramp up very aggressively. The change I make every week is going to be twice as big. At the end of this 16-week period, I'm going to ramp all the way up to 3,725 calories. We're talking about over 3,700 calories a day. That is a massive calorie intake for a lot of people. So if you take that approach instead and you work up from 2,225 up to 3,725, you still have a cumulative energy balance of 42,000 calories per day. So these two approaches, jumping straight to 2,975 or working up to 3,725, the cumulative impact on energy balance is the same. So one person would look back and say, yeah, I gained some weight, but I'm only eating 2,975 calories a day. The other person would say, well, I've gained the same amount of weight, but I'm eating 3,700. Like, I've clearly built up my metabolic capacity by 800 calories. That's not the case. When we look at these short time scales and these fixed time scales, we find that ramping your way up can create this illusion that your energy expenditure has dramatically changed. In the short term, it's difficult to see that. But if people continue this, so in this example, the one person keeps eating 2,975, the other person continues building or stays at 3,700 calories a day, over time, those body composition differences are going to become very substantial and very apparent. And the reason that's important is because I often see anecdotes of people saying, I've been doing this reverse dieting and I'm just amazed at how lean I am at my current calorie intake. And it's almost always people who have been ramping up their calories over the last month or two. It's very rarely someone who says, yeah, this is crazy. I've been doing very meticulous tracking my entire fitness journey. And now for very long time scales, I just eat 1,000 calories more than I used to. It's way more rare to see that. And it's exceedingly more rare to see people say, yeah, I did this in the off season, and now that I'm dieting, it's a breeze. Because again, a lot of times that initial inflation of energy intake is actually more of an illusion than anything. And any metabolic changes that actually do occur during that time period probably go away the moment you start dieting.
Yeah. Or, I mean, to the extent where it's not an illusion, like, and this is something we've talked about off mic before, but like, I think, I do think reverse dieting can work, not necessarily for the reasons that are advertised, but as kind of a trick to convince people to actually be in a caloric surplus for once.
Yeah.
Like people who are trying to be super lean all the time, they're chronic dieters, and they've never really given themselves a long-ish term energy surplus to actually like build some muscle and be able to train hard and not be super fatigued. Like, if you can convince them, oh yeah, ramp up your calories gradually, you're not going to gain much fat, which if you told them on the front end, like, oh yeah, you totally are, they wouldn't listen to you in the first place.
Right.
So you can kind of trick them into actually getting into a surplus for a while, building muscle. And then, yeah, maybe their next diet does go better, and maybe their energy expenditure is a little bit higher at the end of the diet. But it's not necessarily because they, quote unquote, built up their metabolic capacity due to the reverse diet itself. You just finally tricked them to get into a surplus for the first time in 5 years.
Right.
And the ability to build muscle and train hard from getting in that surplus was the thing that helped them in their subsequent weight loss phase.
Yeah, and another thing, like we mentioned previously, it kind of tricks people into saying, well, we're going to do, even if it's not a surplus, if you say, well, we're going to do a maintenance phase, but you're actually going to really meticulously track. A lot of people, very understandably so, during a maintenance phase, they say, oh, cool, like this is a time, I'll just make sure body weight's pretty stable. When it starts drifting up, I'll tighten things up. If it starts drifting down, I'll tighten things up and kind of course correct and keep body weight stable. But in that context, the maintenance phase works fine, but people often underestimate their actual calorie intake during the maintenance phase. Mm-hmm. For a lot of people, it's the first time that they've committed to a long maintenance phase and actually gotten a very good, accurate quantification of how many calories they eat during a maintenance phase.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely part of it. And then the final thing I want to mention here is an illusion that involves an inversion of cause and effect. Because, I mentioned previously that when someone after a weight loss diet goes from an energy deficit to energy balance, there are real things that happen. Like maintenance phases have physiological impacts. We do see a small partial restoration of total daily energy expenditure. For a lot of folks, we do see a partial or full attenuation of some of those symptoms of relative energy deficiency. Mm-hmm. And in some people, this can create subjective improvements in quality of life and just how they feel that have really important impacts on their activity level, the way that they train. Like going from a deficit to a maintenance is a real intervention that does real physiological changes. And most importantly, those have been documented. Mm-hmm. We can look at the research and say, what happens when a person who's been dieting goes to maintenance? We can look at actual evidence and say how it affects how they feel, their energy expenditure, the way they train, their activity level. Those are real things that the physiology literature fully accounts for. Mm-hmm. One thing that we cannot look at the literature for is saying, well, but then what happens if I increase my carbs by 10 grams every day?
Yeah.
There's no evidence to suggest that that's a physiological relevant intervention that would do anything other than eventually, if you do it long enough, induce some extra weight gain, mm-hmm. right? And so when I talk about cause and effect, the reason this comes up is because a lot of times people frame reverse dieting as, well, I was at neutral energy balance, right? At my low, crappy post-diet energy expenditure. But when I bumped my carbs up 10 grams, my body decided, for some reason, contrary to everything we know about weight regain and post-diet fat storage, I'm instead going to ramp up my energy expenditure to match that. Mm-hmm. Why? I literally have no idea.
Yeah.
But I'm going to do that. And then that happens, and then you increase your carbs 10 grams again, and your body says, again, I have no regard for the weight regain literature. I'm going to do a thing that's never actually really been observed and bump up again mm-hmm. and match that. And for some reason, this weight-reduced body has decided, this is my permanent body weight, and if you keep ramping up calories, I promise to keep increasing energy expenditure to match it. That's never been observed, and nothing close to it has been observed. Mm-hmm. But what has been observed is that when you go from a deficit to maintenance, energy expenditure does increase a little bit. And so what I posit in this article is that reverse dieting is the effect of establishing neutral energy balance. It is not the cause that is ramping up energy expenditure. So rather than saying, because I increased my carbs 10 grams, my body is elevating my energy expenditure, I think it works the other way around. I think I was dieting, right? And so my energy expenditure was suppressed. when I went from negative to neutral energy balance, all of a sudden, I'm in what we would call a maintenance phase, and I'm in neutral energy balance. And in response to that, my energy expenditure probably will go up a little bit, not all the way to where it started, but a little bit. And we have ample evidence to suggest that that happens. We're in the research again. We're not in the imaginary world, right? Mm-hmm. And so as a result, oh, wow, I jumped to maintenance and then my energy expenditure bumped up a little bit. And actually over time, because of that, it looks like my weight is actually starting to drop just a tiny bit, And so because I have restored neutral energy balance, eventually I actually have the opportunity in the future to increase my carbs by 10 grams just to get back to neutral energy balance, right? So I started in this huge deficit, I closed that gap, and then my energy expenditure creeps up a little bit, which has been observed. And so now I have to bump my calories up a little bit just to stay in neutral energy balance. And so what I believe is happening based on the evidence is that reverse dieting is this gradual increase in calories is enabled by getting back to approximately neutral energy balance instead of staying in the deficit. And so what we see is, yes, over time, a person can gradually increase their calories a little bit by little bit by little bit and stay relatively weight neutral over that time period. But it's not because the 10 grams of carbs are doing something special that's never been observed in the literature. It's because getting to approximately maintenance is doing something that absolutely has been observed in the literature. And so we're able to continue bumping calories up because we are keeping pace with an energy expenditure that is very subtly climbing, because instead of being in this big prolonged deficit, we're doing our best to stay in approximately neutral energy balance. Mm-hmm. And the analogy I draw on there is related to Brian Miner and Eric Helms. And I don't know if they had other authors on that paper. They published a really insightful article about basically how we view progressive overload with resistance training, right? And so we don't need a maximal training stimulus every workout to be able to make adaptation. We just need the training stimulus to be good enough to impose more adaptation. And so they basically say, you're not doing progressive overload. You're not causing it by adding 5 pounds on the bar. What's happening is you're giving an adequate training stimulus, you're getting stronger, and you're adding 5 pounds on the bar to make sure that the training stimulus continues to be adequate. So you're adding pounds on the bar because you're getting stronger versus every little minute change in training load making this enormous difference in terms of your progression over time. Yeah. So I think it's an analogous.
Just to state that another way.
Yeah.
Adding 5 more pounds to the bar doesn't force you to get stronger.
Yes.
You're able to add 5 more pounds to the bar because you have already gotten stronger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in an analogous way, 10 grams of carbs is not forcing your energy expenditure upward to a meaningful degree. You are able to add in an additional 10 grams because you have been, instead of being in a deficit, you have gotten close to approximately neutral energy balance, and your energy expenditure is responding in kind. Mm-hmm. So those are the 4 illusions that I think are contributing to why we see so many of these positive anecdotes. And again, they are compelling, they are convincing, and I do not fault anyone for saying, wow, this really looks like it's doing something. As I mentioned, simply being in maintenance does real physiological things compared to being in a deficit. So I'm not even saying that nothing's happening during reverse dieting, but what I am saying is that reverse dieting in most applications is really just a more stressful mechanism of getting into a maintenance phase or getting into neutral energy balance, which does actually do things, right? So people might experience positive things during a reverse diet, but the only positive physiological things going on that would make sense in a reverse diet would also be absolutely accomplished by simply doing a maintenance phase. Mm-hmm. And working up to it slowly doesn't really seem to add any benefit. If you have a good estimate of what your energy expenditure is at the end of a diet, you should be able to jump straight to it and enjoy all of those benefits of neutral energy balance without delaying that process and kind of saying, well, I'm going to stay in a deficit and just bump up 10 grams at a time until I get there, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that people often ask on this topic is like, is there ever a reason to try reverse dieting?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we own Macro Factor, and for all the reasons I just talked about for way too long, we don't have a reverse diet function because, frankly, I don't think the evidence is there. I don't want to take users on this ride where they spin their wheels and have these really high expectations and ultimately end up disappointed. You know, it's an evidence-based app, and we want to make sure that we are providing all the best features that we can possibly provide that are also compatible with the evidence, right? But people still ask, like, hey, you know, is there ever a reason to try reverse dieting? One good reason is you're just curious and you want to try it.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. I don't lose sleep over the idea that someone out there is currently reverse dieting, right? So if you're really intrigued, you're really interested, absolutely, you're welcome to it. And we design Macro Factor in a way that enables that, you know, and we've got a thing on the knowledge base that tells you how to do that. But basically just setting an extremely slow weight gain goal, it just provides that little upward pressure on your calorie target. Boom, you've done a reverse diet, but it's not some special feature that we're willing to advertise and say, hey, come check out this incredible new thing that defies physiology, right? If you want to try to just set the lowest possible rate of weight gain and see if it nudges your calories upward, you know, by all means, if you're just interested, that's fine. You can do it in Macro Factor or you can do it without Macro Factor. Doesn't really matter. Yeah. But I think the most justifiable scenario for why you might want to try reverse dieting is you just finished a fat loss phase and you'd like to maintain, you know, basically all of your weight loss in the long term. You're very adamant that you don't want to regain weight. Your energy intake, your calorie target at the end of your diet is a bit unsustainable for you. So you're like, okay, I want to maintain this physique exactly. I don't want to regain fat, but I don't think I can maintain this low calorie intake for a long time. But you also don't really know what your total daily energy expenditure is. You know what you've been eating and you know that it's been promoting weight loss, but you're not really sure what your energy expenditure is. In that scenario, there is a possibility that just guessing your energy expenditure and therefore your target for calories in a maintenance phase, you could overestimate that energy expenditure and therefore the calorie target. And if it's a substantial overestimation, you might regain fat because, like we've said, all the evidence suggests that if you recently lost weight, you are physiologically primed for some pretty efficient fat regain, right? So in that scenario, I do think it makes sense, theoretically, to say, well, instead of making a guess that I don't feel good about, maybe I'll just slowly work up and test the waters. I'll keep those illusions previously mentioned in mind, and I'll try to settle on a maintenance phase that's going to work for the long term. Now, your energy expenditure might go up in the process as you get more from a deficit to neutral energy balance. Is that going to make your next diet easier? Probably not. You'll probably still experience metabolic adaptation next time around once you get back into a sizable energy deficit. But it basically, the concept of reverse dieting functions as a way to work toward a maintenance target when you're not certain of what it is likely to be, and you're very adamant that you don't want to regain any fat. But I will also mention that one of the reasons we don't offer that feature in Macro Factor, aside from the lack of evidence and the excessive hype that comes with that term, is the fact that if you're using Macro Factor, the guesswork is gone. You know, we keep a very well calculated running estimate of your total daily energy expenditure. So the moment you stop a diet, a weight loss diet, and switch to maintenance, we're not just guessing. You know, we have empirical data to indicate what your most likely maintenance target is. We put you there, and then we have a dynamic maintenance approach where if your energy expenditure does start creeping up because you've gone from a deficit to neutral energy balance, the app will pick up on that in your weight trend and it will increase your calorie target. So basically, again, the reverse dieting might occur, you know, in the sense that calories might creep up over time, but that's the effect of the maintenance phase, not something that is causing this previously unidentified physiological effect.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I think that pretty much does it. I just want to wrap up with some practical applications. There's really no evidence to suggest that reverse dieting accomplishes anything more than a fairly standard maintenance phase. When it comes to metabolic adaptation, this is not something that stops weight loss in its tracks. It's not something that guarantees weight regain. And so what we should be trying to do is simply quantify it and account for it.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're dieting, it's nice to see how your expenditure is changing so that you can simply keep either making calorie adjustments to accommodate it or extend your weight loss timeline to accommodate it, because both of those options should be effective based on the actual research in human beings losing weight.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really what we use to guide the way we approach things in macro factor.
Or to use it as an indication to maybe try to increase activity levels.
Yes. Yeah, that is absolutely another way that you could account for metabolic adaptation. But we're not trying to totally stifle it or circumvent it or fix it or anything like that, because, as we've talked about, the available evidence does not really leave wiggle room for the concept that reverse dieting is going to, really effectively and robustly and persistently reverse these things.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're interested in reverse dieting just because you're curious or because you want to transition to a long-term maintenance phase and you don't know what your target should be, I do think it's justifiable. But for most cases, I think just a pretty simple maintenance phase should be good enough to get the job done there. And based on the evidence, a maintenance phase can be a really positive thing, but there's really no evidence of, and really no evidence supporting the theoretical concepts that reverse dieting should really be any more effective than a maintenance phase.
Well, based on where this segment started, when you asked me what good things I thought reverse dieting would do for me personally, I have to say that I'm very upset with how this segment went. You've dashed all of my hopes upon the rocks, but I will try to be strong and adapt to this very unfortunate information that you're giving me.
Well, I appreciate your resiliency in the face of this bad news. One closing comment that I want to reiterate. In this segment, I talked about how we approach these types of things in macro factor. And the reason is we developed the app to accommodate challenges in the process of trying to gain weight, lose weight, maintain weight, etc. So it's really important to recognize you can take all this information and use it and never spend a cent on macro factor. And that's fine. You don't need macro factor to apply any of this information. And yeah, like we said previously, the purpose here was not to sell you on macro factor. It was just to kind of readjust the public perception of reverse dieting, because it seems to have just taken on a life of its own and gotten so far from the evidence that we really do need to rein it back in a little bit. Yeah. So there's you don't need macro factor to make any of this information useful. And as we mentioned previously, my only conflicts of interest would lead me to say, actually, reverse dieting, very effective. In fact, find the first study that ever mentioned it. It's mine. I'm a visionary. And also, let's throw it in the app and market it and make a bunch of money off of it.
Mm-hmm.
But we haven't done that. And to be very honest, it would have been way quicker and easier to just put it in the app than to write the 60-page article explaining why it's not in the app.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, we don't believe in it, and so that's why we don't have it.
Yeah.
But I will say, if the evidence comes around and I have to eat my words and say, actually, 2014 Eric was way smarter than 2022 Eric, we can always put it in.
Well, I mean, if anything, it's more grotesque than that, because initially you put forth the idea of reverse dieting.
And to be clear, I didn't make it up. I was the first person to mention it in a peer-reviewed paper.
Yeah, but you did that, and now in this article, you're publicly eating crow. But to extend the metaphor, you're going to have to figure out how to regurgitate the crow and bring it back to life, Dr. Frankenstein style.
Yeah.
And if, we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Yeah, I'll put together a narrative about like, you know what? You gotta stick to your guns. I let the haters get in my head. I let them convince me that I wasn't actually a beautiful genius, but indeed I am. So we'll go back.